Alright, we'll continue with the exercise that we were just working on. We're going to go ahead and define border, and we're going to be experimenting with different things we can do with margin and padding on the additional elements that are within this web page. So I'm going to come back to my markup, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new style for my P tag, which is my paragraph tag, of course. And let's go ahead, and the first thing I'm going to do is just going to turn the border on for my paragraph tag. So I'm going to create a 2-pixel border. It is going to be, let's just go ahead and use dashed, and I'm going to define the color of this to, again, being a color that is not necessarily a web safe color. So if we save and we refresh this in the browser, you can now see that I have these green dashed lines around my paragraphs. Let's go ahead and let's set a little bit of spacing between the paragraphs, and I can do that using margin. So I'm going to come back to my XHTML document, and we'll go ahead and we'll add a little bit of margin. Let's go ahead and let's set the margin, and I want to set the margin to all sides at once. So I'm going to go ahead and set the margin, and let's set the margin to be a % value. I'm going to use the same % value that I used on my H3, so I'm going to use 75%. I'm going to go ahead and set the font size for my paragraph, and I'm going to use M's. I'm going to use 0.75 M's, and I will go ahead and also set the, let's just set the width of the box itself. So I'm going to go ahead and set the width, and for these boxes we'll use a fixed value of 600 pixels for the width. So I'm going to save, and let's refresh and see what this does to our web page. You can see that obviously I didn't put a point in my M value since everything has disappeared and is way off there. Where did I make my little error? Right here. Okay, I went ahead, and what I actually wanted to put was my margins shouldn't have been set to 75%. That was much too high. I was actually I was thinking about the width up here that we set for 75%. So let's bring this down. We'll use a pixel value so it's a little bit more fixed. Let's just go ahead and set the margins to 15 pixels all the way around. That should bring our content back into the range of the living here on my web page. So you can see what happened. Now I have some nice spacing in between my paragraphs, and it definitely helps with the legibility of what's going on in my web page to have a little bit of spacing and not have everything all butted up next to each other. We have the borders, and they are appearing as specified. I want to show you something that happens when you're sizing. Right now I set the font size of my H3 tag to 1.5 M's. I'm going to go ahead, and we set the width to 75%. Here I have the font size of my paragraph tags to 0.75 M's, so it's a little bit smaller value. Let's go ahead and change the width down here to 75%, and let's look at what's going to happen to our web page. So I'll save that, and I'll come back, and we'll reload the page. And you can see I'm going to set my margin actually and padding to the same as the H3, so we can just kind of discover what's going on here as well. So I have left and top margins of 20. I'll just change this to 20. Let's just change our right margin to 22, so we're using uniform values. The only margin I haven't set on my H3 is the bottom margin, and we'll just leave that off for now, but I did set the margins all around the paragraph tag to 20 pixels. And the other thing that I'm going to do is put a little bit of padding in my paragraphs as well. So I'll go ahead and define the padding, and we'll use the same value. Let's use a padding of 5 pixels. And let's save, and we'll refresh. And you can see that now all of my boxes are going to resize to be 75% of the page. They're all uniform now. This is going to go ahead and give me a flexible type of layout. So if you ever want a layout that is more flexible, this is a good way to accomplish that using something like %. If you have a layout that you really control the design, you want it to be more fixed, then you're probably going to need to use pixel values for that. There are some things that are going to affect how you actually lay out your page and the results you get if you use percent versus pixels. Remember how we used pixels for our margin and padding. Let's go ahead and let's change some of those settings to percentages so we can kind of discover what that does to our page. Right now our boxes are all uniform in size, okay? And remember, we have pretty much the same padding and margin around all the boxes in our content as well. If I come back to my web page and I go ahead and I change, let's just change our margin setting. Instead of using a margin of pixels, let's set our margin to, let's use an M value. So let's down here use a value of 1 ems, and I'm going to set all of my margins up here as well to 1 ems. So I'm going to still keep these set at the exact same values, but let's look and see what this does on our web page. I'll save my page and I'm going to refresh, and you can see that now the boxes are no longer in line. If I resize my page, they'll never be back in line. The H3 tag is indented a little bit more than the paragraph tag, and it goes out a little bit more. Now, you might be wondering why this is happening since I set the margins to the exact same setting, 1em. It's because in this situation I'm using ems instead of pixels. The em, even though this is the same value, 1em, because it is in the H3 tag up here, this M is going to be linked to the size that I set for my font size. So 1em of the H3 tag is 1.5 ems. Where on the paragraph tag, I set my font size to 0.75 ems, so 1em is 0.75. So you can see when you do something like this, instead of using pixel value, you may use M value. And if your tags are going to have different font sizes, which undoubtedly they probably will, you're going to get some results that are, not so uniform. So keep that in mind when you're working with a box model and you're thinking about values that you want to go ahead and specify for the different tags. You might want to give these fixed values so you don't run into that sort of problem if you want to have everything look uniform. It's important to be able to, work with different types of sizings. I mean, here we have pixels, we have ems, we have percentages, and when we have them styled and working in conjunction with each other, we get results that are uniform. But if you don't understand how they work together, you might get results that are a little more sporadic. So now you know that the padding basically adds the space between the box's content and the border of the box. As a part of what's inside the box, it's going to take on the color of the box's background, and we see that illustrated up here in the H3. Padding is an important tool because you can use it to create white space, which is definitely a place for the eye to rest. You no longer need to clog up your markup with presentation code by adding, additional table cells or spacer gifs or anything else that you might have used in the past to create white space. You can now basically achieve the exact same effect economically by adding CSS padding styles. So this is a much more helpful way to create the white space in your page. Margins are slightly more complex than border and padding. First, most block level elements like paragraph, headings, lists, and so on, they have default margins. So think about the space between two paragraphs, and we saw that when we first loaded this page before we had any CSS styles working. It's basically a really good idea, as I mentioned before, to use the universal selector to set the margin and padding to 0 so you don't get confused by which margins and padding the browser's setting and which ones you're actually setting. You can declare all of these things in your style sheet, and it's much more better practice to kind of define these things yourselves, so you're going to end up with results that you are in control of. There is some other things that we need to talk about that have to do with margins specifically that will affect the way your layout works. So we'll go ahead and we'll discuss that in the next movie.